On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
Liberals, they're liberal about everything. They care about climate change. They care about abortion. They care about inequality. They care about separation of church and state. They care about defending educational institutions. Whereas these conservative Jews care about Israel, period. And they're there every day. And where the liberals are only there like one day a month.
Hi, this is Phoebe Maltz-Bovey. Welcome to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. So I had always thought of America's historical friendliness towards Israel as kind of a piece with its ability to resist at least left-wing forms of anti-Semitism that took root in Europe or in Canada. There were definitely moments in the period of time after October 7th, like when a paraglider flyer went up on my block, on the block where I live, that I started to question what I was doing and wondered whether I should have just stayed the New York Jew I was born. But lately, I find myself having to rethink everything as Israel itself acts in ways that have even some of its staunchest defenders wondering what is going on there. But also more directly, as Donald Trump has decided to make it his mission to go on this anti-Semitism, with the scare quotes, crusade that seems arguably to be making things worse for Jews. Everything seems very topsy-turvy. We address these topics a lot on The Jewish Angle. Me speaking both royally and with guests. And today I'm very honored that our guest is Eric Alterman. Professor Alterman is a CUNY, so that's City University of New York for Canadians, distinguished professor of English and journalism. He was for many years a columnist at The Nation and now has a column in The American Prospect. And his most recent book from 2022 is called We Are Not One, A History of America's Fight Over Israel. And it's his May 8th New Republic article, The Coming Jewish Civil War Over Donald Trump, that was the pretext for having him on today. So, Professor Alterman, welcome to The Jewish Angle. First, I just wanted to ask, how did you get into sort of punditry if you're a professor? How did that happen?
Oh, I did it first. I've had 3 careers simultaneously. I've been a journalist, although I wouldn't say a good journalist, but most of my career I've been identified as a journalist. I've worked in think tanks and I've been an academic. I began like sort of an intern working in think tanks, liberal think tanks in Washington, and doing journalism on the side. And then I kept going back to school, and eventually I got my doctorate in history, even though I'm a professor of English. I'm a historian. But I kept at all 3 for most of this period. So I was hired. The reason I'm an English professor is because I was originally hired as a professor of journalism, but for bureaucratic reasons, I no longer am, and now I'm a professor of English, but I teach film and literature as history. So that's my academic affiliation. And I continue to write, when I can about what I care about. And lately I've mostly cared about American Jews.
Well, as an American Jew, I can't fault you for your... I'm also a Canadian Jew now, but I'm both.
Wait. Is Canada not America? Excuse me.
Well, that is the,
Hello.
many a blue sky argument.
Let the calls begin.
Yes, certainly.
How dare you?
I will happily, if people want to provide feedback
Canadians.
on the podcast. Yes. So
my degree is actually in U.S. history because we're sensitive to this topic.
So the headline of your piece, The Coming Jewish Civil War Over Donald Trump, it's in the headline, but it's also in the piece itself. So something I've been wondering, is it that American Jewry is divided, or is it more that there's a divide between sort of the official positions of American Jewish organizations and the American Jewish population?
Yes.
So
shall I elaborate?
Please do.
American Jewry is very much divided if you consider Orthodox Jews to be part of American Jewry. So 10 to 15% of American Jewry are Orthodox Jews, and they are 100% in with Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu and even Ben Gvir and Smotrich. And they are a growing number of American Jews, so that people don't take this seriously enough. But 40% of the Jewish babies being born in New York are ultra-Orthodox Jewish babies. So that number is only increasing. But if you talk about American Jews, the way we usually think about American Jews, which is conservative, reform, and Reconstructionist Jews. I bring in Reconstructionists because I happen to be one. They are not divided very much. They're divided about 75 or 70-30 at best. And that 70 is, they are the only group. I got into an argument with another historian about this the other day. I said coded as white in the piece, and he says who passes as white. It should be.
Oh, are we going to do that?
No, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I'm doing justice to this distinction. Who remain liberal, and all other white people are not liberal anymore. They're not Democrats. It's impossible to find another group of white people, white ethnicities that consistently support Democrats. Now, the representation of what I call the legacy groups, the famous Jewish groups like the ADL and AIPAC and the American Jewish Committee, they do not share the politics of the vast majority of American Jews. They are much more conservative. They used to only be more conservative on matters relating to Israel, but now they've grown more conservative on a lot of other things because everything is somehow related. Anti-Semitism is fighting anti-Semitism, quote unquote anti-Semitism in many cases, is a way of defending Israel. Opposing DEI is a way of defending Israel. Race relations, opposing Black Lives Matter is a way of defending Israel. So Israel, as it's become increasingly unpopular with liberals and also liberal Jews, and particularly young liberal Jews, is looming larger and larger in the American political landscape, and that's why we're getting something approaching a civil war.
The overwhelming majority, like if you talk about different groups and how they vote, Jews voting Democrats, that's still something, and that didn't disappear with Trump. Like there were a lot of sort of think pieces about.
They stuck with Harris.
Yeah.
In a way no other white ethnicity did.
Right. I mean, then there's the question of how white Jews are, or whether even that's the framing for where Jews are in America at this point. But I just also wanted to ask, though, so if most American Jews are Democrats, what explains the political positioning of these major legacy American Jewish organizations? So basically, like, what explains the mismatch? Is it just kind of like that there's a lag?
No, it's that there's a thing called money. They are funded by wealthy people.
But there are
Jews.
Wealthy, like, are there not, I'm going to sound very conspiratorial, but are there not liberal Hollywood type Jews who
There's two things going on. There's two things going on simultaneously. One is that, well, three things. One is that, like AIPAC, it's a Jewish organization, but a lot of its funding is not Jewish anymore. Christian evangelicals are the biggest supporters of Israel in the United States.
I have many questions about that too.
And Citizens United for Israel, which is run by a pastor who says Hitler was a God's warrior, is the single biggest Jewish pro-Israel organization in the world. But to answer your question about Jewish organizations specifically, there's two reasons. One is money, and these groups are funded by conservative Jewish millionaires and billionaires. But second, the thing about liberal groups, and this is true across the board, not just relating to Israel, liberals, they're liberal about everything. They care about climate change. They care about abortion. They care about inequality. They care about separation of church and state. They care about defending educational institutions. Whereas these conservative Jews care about Israel, period. And they're there every day. And where the liberals are only there like one day a month. So the conservatives are just much more dedicated to Israel than liberals are to defending Israel. That's part two. There's actually a third reason. I don't know if this reason is becoming less and less important, but it was important for a long time, which is that dovish Jews on the issue of Israel, who thought Israel was going too far and being too nasty to the Palestinians and so forth, they were worried that they might be wrong. And if they were wrong, they lose Israel. But if the other guys were wrong, it's a problem for the Palestinians. So even though they thought that what Israel was doing was unnecessary and reflected badly on Jews, they were much less comfortable opposing it, just in case they would turn out to be wrong. Now, I think the fact that this occupation now seems permanent and Israel's government is pretty much agreed upon to be horrible, and Israel's killed over 50,000 people in Gaza and has killed like 500 people in the past week. I think that argument is a lot weaker than it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's been there for a while, and people of the generation slightly older than mine, I think that's still people who grew up with grandparents who lived through the Holocaust and parents who lived through the Holocaust, they still feel that way. They just don't. They're afraid to be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a bit more about this evangelical support for Israel as well. So what is Project Esther? Because it sounds like something that you would get from like the Jewish Women's Archive, but it is extremely not that.
Project Esther is similar to Project 2025, except it relates to the destruction of the pro-Palestinian movement in the United States. And it was written originally by, I think, 4 people at the Heritage Foundation before the election, 3 of whom were conservative evangelical Christians. One of whom was a Jew. It was run by some conservative religious Jews in Israel, and was since semi-embraced by these legacy organizations. But it's the basis by which pro-Palestinian demonstrations and supporters have been associated with supporting terrorism rather than just having views that people might disagree with.
So I guess, but so is it mainly the Heritage Foundation, all of this? How many Jews are involved in this?
Well, when you say in this, you have to define your terms.
Well, Project Esther.
Well, no, Project Esther itself was just like a few people at the Heritage Foundation.
I see.
Writing this document. But to the degree that the Trump administration, unlike within a week of being, I think it was January 29th, Trump issued an executive order that appeared to follow the outlines of Project Esther and has since incorporated more and more of it. Now, you could call that a coincidence, or you could say that the Trump administration is following that path that was laid out by these people who wrote the project. They've certainly done nothing that would contradict it. And the idea is simple. It's a lot like McCarthyism and communism was. It's like they would say, if you're a liberal, you're sympathetic to communists, therefore you should be prosecuted as helping communism. And if you're a immigrant kicked out, and if you're an American, watch out. And they're doing the same thing with Palestinian and terrorists. You're pro-Palestinian, you're helping the terrorists, and if you're an immigrant, you're going to be kicked out, arrested by ICE, by people in masks. And if you're an American, well, you're going to suffer other sorts of consequences.
I guess what I'm wondering is how much of this is about a civil war within American Jewry, and how much of this is kind of almost like a PR problem, where it seems as if the message that this thing that Trump is doing is not on behalf of Jews fails to really take hold. And there's this kind of discourse about Trump's helping Jews, Trump's doing this thing for anti-Semitism. And Jews are like, it's not, we didn't ask him to do this, but there just aren't that many Jews, and nobody's listening. You know what I mean?
No, that's the Jews you and I know and hang out with, but that's not.
But it's also most American Jews.
It is, but most American Jews don't matter. The Jews that matter are the ones who either have the ear of President Trump or powerful members of Congress, or the ones who fund these legacy organizations.
So it's not really a PR issue, but it is still at the level of communications in a way, or organizing, because it doesn't seem like what has to happen is American Jews need to be convinced that Trump isn't doing nice things on our behalf. It's more like American Jews are convinced for the most part, but the ones who actually you hear from are the handful, relatively speaking, with unusual take on things.
Well, there's always been a tension and lately an absolute conflict between American Jewish liberalism and support for Zionism. And the way that American Jews dealt with that was to ignore it, to basically allow their Zionism to trump their liberalism when necessary and then go back to it. And that doesn't work anymore because Israel has become so awful in its behavior and looms so large in our political discourse. And the legacy organizations and Republicans consider all opposition to Israel to be anti-Semitism. So American Jews are afraid of increasing anti-Semitism, and some of this is ginned up by the ADL and other organizations because the ADL considers most pro-Palestinian demonstrations to be ipso facto anti-Semitic. So the anti-Semitism is growing in the United States, in part inspired by Israel's behavior in Gaza, and in part inspired by the fact that Trump has invited neo-Nazis into the mainstream. So Jews are worried about both of these things. So, and again, most people aren't paying that close attention. So when Trump says, I'm fighting anti-Semitism, and the American Jewish Committee and the ADL and AIPAC all say, okay, great, we finally have a president who understands the importance of fighting anti-Semitism, particularly on campus, where our students are vulnerable to the ideological indoctrination of Palestinian Hamas sympathizers. It resonates, okay? So a lot of liberal Jewish leaders are saying, no, wait, look at this carefully. That's not what's happening. What's happening is that this anti-Semitism message is actually being exploited to destroy our democracy and the educational institutions that have served American Jewry better than anything ever has served any group of Jews in history. And we need to defend them. And so people have to make a choice as to who they believe in this regard. And for most people, it's not that simple. For you and I, who pay a lot of attention, it is simple. But for most people, they're hearing it. Jews are they're good citizens by and large compared to everybody else. But still, particularly in this world we live in today of really segmented social media audiences and inability to know where the information is coming from. It's hard to know what's true. I mean, the ADL sends out these action alerts every day about some anti-Semitism crisis taking place, and they send it out to about 300,000 people every single day. There's only a little over 2 million Jews in the United States, so it's true that if you look carefully, they don't have a case, and that's why in this one case, the liberal side seems to be winning, and the ADL and the American Jewish Committee have pulled back a little bit from their embrace of Trump and his actions. Something I can't remember happening in the past, but it's still an endless fight.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
Is there anything analogous in American political life where there's a group whose supposed interests are sort of so far from what the majority of the population's interests, like from how they poll,
Well, the Vietnam War.
No, but I mean, like currently, I mean, today, like, is there any other demographic where if you poll people of that demographic, they all, like nearly all or mostly, whatever, say they have one political position, but then the leadership claims something different?
I guess I can't answer that.
Because it's so odd. I don't
I
know.
mean, it's striking. I mean, I think the Miami Cuban leadership was always much more hawkish than certainly than most Latin American people in the United States, but also than most Cubans in Florida. I don't know that though. I'm not like they modeled themselves explicitly after AIPAC, the Miami Cubans. They said so,
That's
and
interesting.
and they would punish politicians the same way AIPAC did, and they were very effective at it. Uh, but I don't know enough about the views of the Cuban population in Miami to say how close
Mm-hmm.
they were to their views.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So another thing I wanted to talk about is, so you take on Jewish parochial media as well, which is an area I'm familiar with. Here I am working within it. I even did my doctoral dissertation on the 19th century French version of it in part. So this, I know, that's a world I know better than like APAC or something like that. And I was wondering about some of your classifications and just about kind of the media landscape generally, because you called Jewish Insider right wing, which I guess is somewhat subjective maybe, but the one I really wanted to ask was, you call the Free Press a Jewish media outlet, and that I
Yeah,
wondered about.
I didn't. No, I wrote that kind of sloppily, I have to admit. That sentence is only in there because I wanted to talk about Brent Stevens' journal Sapir. And then I had to identify Brent Stevens with his Times column. And then I had to throw in Barry Weiss because she's a sort of a child of Brett Stevens, ideologically and professionally speaking. But I probably shouldn't have included them because they're not just the Jewish. I mean, they are. I mean, like Brett Stevens' column, they're 100% behind everything Israel does, but they do a lot of things, not just Jewish stuff.
Right. I mean, because I started to think, I mean, my familiarity with the media landscape is not infinite, but I was just thinking like there is something like The Point, right? Like there are publications that are more left that have some, at least, of the editors are Jewish. And then also you say that Jewish Currents is the only left thing, but I was thinking of like Mondo Weiss or Jew School, or like, what is it, like
Okay, I didn't say it's
972,
the only. I didn't
or
say it's
that
the only.
they're like the main one. Is
Yes, well,
that they're the main?
Mondo Weiss is total nonsense and crap, and
It has
and
longevity, though. I remember it from like early blogging days.
I've known Phil Weiss for 40 years, and he's a madman, and I don't. My experience with them is that you can't take them seriously. You can't believe what they write, and it's entirely
Mm-hmm.
propagandistic, and that's from considerable personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I left them out on purpose.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I think Jewish Currents is a great publication from a journalistic standpoint. I just find their politics to be on the issue of Israel and Zionism so extreme that, number one, I can't buy into their viewpoint. Like the idea of being unable to condemn October 7th is really a red line in my life. But second of all, I think that constituency is really small. I mean, it's there, and I'm sure it represents the views of all the Jews who happen to be in encampments and
Mm-hmm.
college campuses,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think it has any influence in American political life.
Well, that was another thing I wanted to kind of ask about, because that type of viewpoint, I feel like there's a lot of blurriness in the way these things get discussed, not in the way you're discussing them, but the way they get discussed generally, where the fact that most American Jews are Democrats gets kind of rounded up or down, however you want to say, to like, oh, and most American Jews are anti-Zionist, which is clearly not the case. And this makes me wonder.
Well,
just
you said that in the passive tense, gets rounded up or down too. I don't think that sentence is true at all.
Well, I'll finish maybe my thought. Maybe it'll. I guess
Okay.
just there, like you mentioned, the youth-dominated protest. I'm quoting youth-dominated protest-oriented groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, or also If Not Now, and Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And something that I'm trying to make sense of is how many Jews are we talking about, and how often is it the case? And I say this as somebody who doesn't think you like stop being Jewish if you're anti-Zionist. I'm not trying to question the Jewish cred of the Jews in these groups. That's not where I'm coming from. But what I'm trying to figure out is like, how often is it just that a group that's pro-Palestinian or a protest that's pro-Palestinian foregrounds the handful of Jews involved in it?
we have no idea to what degree the protesters are Jewish and to what degree Jews are anti-Zionist. We don't have good numbers on that. The numbers are too small. First of all, you can't really identify who the protesters are. But second of all, the numbers are too small to really get at. My wild guess is that 20 or 30% of the protesters might be Jewish. And that and maybe half of them are there because they're Jewish. In other words, another half of them are Jewish, but they don't really care so much that they're Jewish.
I think I can fix my passive voice situation because I remembered what it was I was thinking about, and it's Canadian, which is that there was a survey recently that we discussed on the Bonjour High podcast that showed, I forget what it was, something like only 50% of Jews in Canada consider themselves Zionist, but like 90-something% believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And then that 50% number got picked up in outlets, is like, see, Canadian Jews are anti-Zionist after all that.
Well, most American Jews feel deeply connected to Israel. You could call them Zionists. The word Zionism is a tricky word.
Right. I mean, that was the thing that struck me about this was that, like, I mean, I think of Zionism in a way as like thinking that there should be a Jewish state created. So it's a little anachronistic because like there was, but.
Yeah, I think it's a settled conflict. I think I'm a post-Zionist because I don't think Zionism has any meaning anymore. I think the question is what to do about the state of Israel. And I don't think it's going anywhere. So I think being anti the creation of a state, which is a state, and it's going to stay a state, is just dumb. But I mean, who cares what you think? The question is what is to be done. The first time, actually, I was on a panel with Naomi Klein, the most famous Canadian Jewish leftist in human history. This was many years ago. We were on a nation cruise, and I was moderating a panel, and she made this, I thought, very self-righteous statement that I don't think there should be a country that is based on nationality, And I was like, who cares what you think? Here's a country, so what if you don't like it? Then deal with it. And I think so much of the arguments that we have about Israel are just really arguments about people's personal identities. That's really what my book is about. That the reason it's impossible to talk anybody out of their position on Israel is because you're not really talking about the state of Israel. You're talking about who that person is and how they think about themselves. Now, in the data that we do have on American Jews, a remarkable number, in my view, find Israel to be guilty of genocide and apartheid. And the numbers grow as you go down in age. I wouldn't swear this, but I think a majority of young American Jews, 24 and younger, support the Palestinians more than they support Israel. I know it's true of young American Democrats. And the Democratic Party is now about 50-50, when before it would have been 95-5, just not that long ago. So this train is running in that direction for sure. And it's getting worse. Like just this week, if you supported Israel last week, you'd have reason not to support Israel this week.
I should say we're recording on May 20th, because maybe there will be a whole bunch of other reasons.
That's true.
But yeah,
That's true.
yeah.
I had that problem when I was writing my book. I had to change it every day.
Yeah.
But I still think that this intense anti-Zionism as a identity for Jews is very limited. I mean, I think I'm friends actually with the people who fund Jewish Currents. And I'm saying this is not, I mean, it's a good magazine, but this is not something that's going to work as a political movement because there's just not going to be that many Jews who define their Jewishness as opposing everything about the state of Israel. I think far more likely, and this is how I ended my book, are people walking away from Judaism entirely because they're being told by Jewish organizations that to be a Jew, you have to support the state of Israel. And if that's what it means to be Jewish, then they're going to say, okay, I'll find something else to do with my life. I'll find another identity. 25% of the people born Jewish in the United States no longer identify themselves as
So
Jewish.
that struck me in your piece, and I wondered, does the outside world identify them as Jewish? And also, it made me think that maybe that's some of what's going on when the ADL and groups like that choose to do this kind of panic, like the alarm emoji or whatever thing is like sort of like you can't escape kind of messaging.
Well, no, that is what they're saying. And Trump helps them with that because, like, they're saying, Trump and the right wing say you're Jews because we say you're Jews, just like the Nazis did. And the ADL, well, the leader of the HAC, I quote this in my book. He said, young people are going to come back and stay Jewish because of Israel and because of anti-Semitism. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a famous essay. I might get high-minded here for a second. In the early 40s, saying the only reason to be a Jew, the only reason Judaism survives is because of anti-Semitism. There's actually no content to it other than that. And it's a wild overstatement, obviously. There's good reasons to be Jewish, having been given it. I give me something. But to me, I think it's a funny kind of mirror image of the American Jewish organizations. They're not selling Judaism. They're selling anti-Semitism as a reason to be Jewish. And
they've read too much Sartre. That's really the problem there. So I have a sort of optimistic-ish thought, or like, I don't know if it's
always good to end on optimism.
I'm trying to do that. Okay. So you talk about a burgeoning conflict between the country that Israel is becoming and the values of the majority of American Jews, end quote. But you write this just after mentioning another quote, Netanyahu's deeply unpopular, scandal-plagued extremist right-wing government, end quote. So I took that to mean when you write deeply unpopular in Israel. Okay, so it seems like maybe there is a potential for some kind of common ground between Israeli and American Jews.
Can I just stop you for 1 second because that's a funny sentence. It seems like maybe there is the potential for it. That means it's not going to happen. But go ahead.
Okay, well, that's probably, I think you've accurately pinpointed that this isn't going to happen, but I just wonder if what needs to happen is more sort of active promotion of transnational Jewish solidarity, that isn't so much of this, like, either you're for Trump or you're against Jews or whatever. I don't know if, it's gibberish, right? Because I don't know. I'm not very optimistic.
More Palestinians were killed under the Bennett government than any of the previous Netanyahu governments. And they raided and shut down all of the Palestinian civil society organizations, and they, murdered journalists. And these were the good guys in the election. There was no major party in any of those 5 elections that said we're running on a platform of peace with the Palestinians, and here are the concessions that we have to make in order to achieve peace. That is not part of the discussion in Israel. And I said to myself at some point, well, this is not a country that I can relate to anymore. Now, there are lots of people in Israel I very much admire who are fighting this fight because they live there and it's their country, and they have no choice but if they want to be who they are, to make that fight. But it's not my fight anymore because that country has told me very clearly over a period of the past 40 years, your values are not my values. And I have to accept that. So it's changed my view of the kind of Jew I am. I'm an American Jew, and I care about American Jewish institutions, the future of diaspora Jewry, because I know that the Israelis don't care what I think. I spoke in Tel Aviv right before my book came out, and they were like, okay, why should we care? And I'm like, well, you should care if you don't want to be all alone in the world, because, you're losing us. And they said, well, we have the Christians. We'll be all right.
Oh, boy. Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Alterman.
Yeah, I have my optimistic.
Oh, okay. Do your optimistic.
Works.
Optimistic.
Well, the thing is that ever since 1967, diaspora Jewry, and I imagine Canadian Jewry is similar to American Jewry in this. All I know about Canadian Jewry is Leonard Cohen and that the people in Montreal think their bagels are better than our bagels.
The people of Montreal, sorry, colleagues, the people of Montreal are wrong. But anyway, go on.
Okay, good. So it's only Leonard Cohen you got. Anyway, diaspora Jewry, which is nothing. Leonard Cohen is pretty great. Diaspora Jewry has sort of outsourced its identity to Israel and Zionism, and allowed its own Jewish understanding, understanding of its own Jewishness to atrophy to virtually nothing, unless you're an Orthodox Jew. And the understanding that this no longer works, because leaving aside the current government in Gaza, the Holocaust was a very long time ago. Israel is not the country we imagined. It never was the country we imagined it was, but it's certainly the heroic moment of Israel and Moshe Dayan with the eye patch. Like, that's a long time ago. So that's not going to keep young people Jewish anymore, the way it did for me, actually. My parents sent me to Israel. I became, a big Jew. So what the opportunity now is for Jews and Jewish institutions to reimagine what it means to be a diaspora Jew, and to invest in that, and to gradually divorce themselves from this notion that to be a good Jew means to support Israel and remember the Holocaust, period.
Well, thank you for that more optimistic note, Professor Alterman.
I enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Freeman. Our music is by Frank Freeman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.